I want you to imagine someone's son. He's in his 40s, his life has worn him down. He lives with painful illness that leaves him sick, exhausted, and often unable to leave the house. On top of that, he struggles with addictions, depression, and anxiety that have taken more from him than anyone can see from the outside. Some days he can barely hold it together. He relies on his family for a place to live, for food, for help getting through the week. They're doing their best, and he's doing his best, but the weight of it is crushing. One day, he finally meets a psychiatrist. He goes, hoping that this might finally be the start of real help. His addictions still haven't been treated. His mental health care hasn't truly begun. He's vulnerable, scared, and hanging on by a thread. And in that appointment, instead of being offered a plan to get him stable, MAiD is raised as an option. The assessment moves ahead. And before he ever receives proper support for his mental health or his addictions, he is approved. His MAiD provider is the one who drives him to the place where his life has ended. Speaker, this is someone's son, a son who needed help, not a final exit. Believe it or not, this actually happened here in Canada. And this is where we are headed if we do not act. Unless this Parliament chooses a different path, Canada will allow MAiD for people whose only condition is mental illness. That means men and women struggling with depression, trauma, or overwhelming psychological pain could be steered toward death by a system that too often cannot offer timely treatment, consistent follow-up, or even basic support. That's why I brought forward Bill C-218, the Right to Recover Act. It's simple. It asks Parliament to stop, consider what we've learned, and act responsibly before people are irretrievably harmed. I often think of my grandparents who immigrated here after World War II with very little. They chose Canada because it was a place where people had endless opportunities to better themselves, where neighbors watched out for each other and communities worked in unison to make a better life for all. They built a Canada where the vulnerable were cared for, where the less privileged in society were valued and treated with equal care. Those fundamental values attracted millions of immigrants over the years. But today, many Canadians fear we're losing those values. Canadians themselves remain some of the most compassionate people you'll ever meet. But our system is overwhelmed, stretched thin, and unable to meet the needs of people who are suffering. When people fall through the cracks, the easy temptation is to accept that failure is inevitable. When that happens, people facing mental illness can end up alone, waiting months or sometimes years for specialized treatment. And when help doesn't come, they lose hope. That moment of hopelessness should never be treated as an opportunity for the state to end their lives through MAiD. When this House last debated MAiD, mental illness was not a part of the core discussion. It was added at a last-minute Senate amendment to Bill C-7. The implications weren't fully considered or understood by this House. Now, since then, we've learned a lot more. Psychiatrists across Canada, including the chairs of psychiatry at all 17 medical schools, have told us plainly that there is no reliable way to predict when a mental illness is irremediable, which is a requirement in the MAiD law. People get worse, but they also get better, and most do. There's no test, no scan, and no clinical tool that can reliably tell us someone will never recover. They all deserve that opportunity. They shouldn't be encouraged to give up on themselves. As legislators, we need to listen to what so many medical professionals are telling us. They're telling us how hard it is to distinguish between suicidal ideation and MAiD. The feelings behind them, hopelessness, loneliness, fear, the belief that one is a burden, are the same. For decades, clinicians have understood that when someone feels hopeless or sees themselves in a very negative way, it can look like they're thinking clearly, but they are rational even when their judgment is clouded by despair. In 2021, most of us didn't have the evidence we now have about how MAiD assessment functions in the real world, or the specific dangers of expanding MAiD into mental illness. We now know there's no reliable way to determine when a mental illness is truly irremediable. Suicide prevention experts, including the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, warn that how we talk about these issues shapes the choices people make. And suggesting that death is a solution to suffering undermines hope. It puts people at real risk. Speaker, this expansion to MAiD for mental illness forces Canada into a huge contradiction. On one hand, we invest in suicide prevention. We train professionals to intervene, to listen, or to pull back people from the edge. On the other hand, with the expansion of MAiD, we would invite those same vulnerable people to consider state-facilitated death. So we must ask, who receives suicide prevention and who is guided toward MAiD? If a person suffering from depression calls a crisis line tonight, do we encourage them to hold on, or do we quietly redirect them to an assessor? What principle decides the answer? What medical test? What ethical standard? There is none, because the very feelings that drive someone to seek MAiD, hopelessness, despair, the belief that they are a burden, are the same signals that every suicide prevention worker is trained to treat as a cry for help. We would never tell a struggling teenager that their wish to die is rational. We would not tell a grieving spouse that their darkest moment is a reasonable exit point. We would reach out. We would support them. We would insist that their lives still matter. So why should that change simply because despair is given a different label? When someone feels worthless, our duty is not to agree with them. It's to stand with them until the light returns. Canada must decide, are suicidal citizens people in need of protection or candidates for state-sanctioned death? We cannot pretend that they are both. Besides all this is the fact that we already know the current safeguards are failing. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear about what an expansion to MAiD for mental illness would mean. If Canada cannot protect vulnerable people under the current rules, then expanding eligibility to those whose very illness clouds judgment, hope, and decision-making will lead directly to preventable deaths. We're already witnessing cases where safeguards fail, where capacity is misjudged, and where people are assessed in moments of confusion, exhaustion, or pressure. If the system cannot uphold basic protections now, it won't. It can't protect those suffering from severe psychological distress. An expansion would be reckless. And the evidence is already in front of us. A recent article about Ontario's MAiD Death Review Committee findings lays out in plain and troubling terms cases that would worry every Canadian. They describe a man, I'll call him Bill, who had cancer. Earlier in his illness, he had briefly mentioned MAiD, as frightened patients tend to do. But by the time he was assessed, he was delirious, confused, and heavily sedated. His own medical team made it clear that he no longer had the capacity to make major decisions. Yet, a MAiD assessor shook him awake, took the faint motion of lips as consent, withheld sedation, obtained a rushed virtual second opinion, and ended his life that same day. Bill was not stable. Bill was not capable. He did not understand what was happening. In another case, a woman, let's call her Margaret, wanted palliative care. She said so the day before her death. But she didn't qualify for hospice. And her husband, worn down by caregiver exhaustion, arranged for urgent MAiD assessment instead. The day before, she told him she wanted to die with proper palliative support, but the next day, 2 assessments were rushed through. Her final wishes were overshadowed by the strain of a caregiver who could no longer cope. And another woman, let's call her Alice, living with advanced dementia, unable to communicate her wishes in any meaningful way. Her family brought MAiD forward twice. Minimal documentation, little clarity, no clear expression of consent, yet she was approved. All of these examples were drawn from the auditor's report. These are stories about real people, family members, friends,
Shame.
neighbors, fellow citizens, people to whom we owe a duty of care. Speaker, these demonstrate that vulnerable Canadians are already at risk under the current MAiD regime. People who are confused, pressured, exhausted, or unable to communicate are slipping through the safeguards that were supposed to protect them. If safeguards fail for patients with physical illness, where assessing capacity is clear and verifiable, what will happen when the only condition is a mental illness, which by definition clouds judgment and hope? To offer death at that moment will place some of the most vulnerable people in this country directly in harm's way.
Right.
Today, a person deemed unable to manage their finances must undergo rigorous capacity assessments, interviews, documentation, expert review, collateral information, verification, because we recognize the risk of exploitation. Yet for MAiD, a situation of life or death, a brief conversation can suffice, no thorough evaluation, and when the safeguards fail, there seems to be few consequences. We now live in a country in which we protect bank accounts better than a human life. Speaker, we also know that families across Canada are deeply shaken by how MAiD was carried out for their loved ones. They describe decisions that felt rushed, influenced by poverty, loneliness, or a lack of access to proper treatment, not by a calm and informed choice. These experiences are warnings from the very people who lived through the consequences. And Canadians are uneasy. Polls show a clear majority do not support MAiD for mental illness alone. Provinces are asking Ottawa to reconsider, calling for a stop. And Quebec, one of the most permissive MAiD jurisdictions in the world, has banned it by law. International human rights experts have raised the alarm, including the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, who has urged Canada to step back, warning that our trajectory risks discriminating against people with disabilities and mental illness. They recommend repealing this expansion entirely. That is what Bill C-218 does. And we must remember a crucial truth. Recovery from mental illness isn't rare, but common. Time and again, people who once felt utterly hopeless have rebuilt their lives once they received proper care and stable support. Every one of us knows someone, a neighbor, a colleague, a family member, who walked through a very dark season and is now grateful to be alive. These stories matter because they show us what's at stake. Sadly, that's not true in every case, but there is no reliable way to know in advance who will recover and who will not. No test, no scan, no certainty. I respectfully suggest that when someone's judgment is clouded by psychological distress, our duty is to offer treatment, protection, and time, not an irreversible decision based on guesswork. If MAiD is expanded, we will be forced into an impossible paradox. A suicidal person calling a crisis line is urged to hold on. Yet, if they request MAiD, that same despair may be treated as justification for death. This is why Bill C-218 is necessary. It stops the 2027 expansion to mental illness because the evidence cannot support it, the safeguards cannot sustain it. Vulnerable Canadians are already at risk. Expanding eligibility now is reckless. A strong country does not turn its back on those who suffer, but believes in their future and gives them time and care to heal. Speaker, I urge every member in this House to support Bill C-218 so that Canada remains a nation that protects the vulnerable, offers treatment before despair, and gives every person the chance to recover. Let's take this responsibility seriously. Let's listen to the warnings of those who are assessing the failures in the system. Let's listen to the families who've lived through the consequences of MAiD, to those who survived mental illness and rebuilt their lives. And let's remember the kind of country we claim to be, one that protects the vulnerable and gives people the time, care, and dignity they need to heal. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Question or commentaire. The Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
My father suffered from 4 different types of cancer over 5 years, and indeed opted for medical assistance in dying, which took place in August of 2024. Although sitting with him that day was one of the hardest times of my life, I fully supported his choice to participate in MAiD, and I supported the process as it took place and was there for it. I wonder if the member across would share how she voted initially for the initial legislation on medical assistance in dying.
The Honourable Member for Cloverdale, Langley City.
Mr. Speaker, I was not in the House when the original vote happened. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Beauharnois, Salaberry, Soulanges, Huntingdon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must say, I am quite shocked by what I have heard. I do agree with my colleague that there needs to be more mental health services. Of course, this is an area under provincial jurisdiction, therefore under Quebec jurisdiction. We should have enough resources to support everyone going through mental health issues. But my colleague has misled the public. She has created this impression that current legislation will allow medical assistance in dying for someone with a severe mental illness as the sole underlying condition. There was a decision made in 2017, made by a joint parliamentary committee. It gave the power to the health minister. We all know that MAiD will not be ready to address this thorny question. It won't even be ready in 2027. It looks like the bill is a thin edge of the wedge to end medical assistance in dying.
Mr. Speaker, it's very clear that Bill C-218 is only about MAiD for those solely with mental health issues. But I would like to say that no one in the House denies that some Canadians suffer profoundly from mental illness. Their pain is real and it deserves our deepest compassion. But compassion must be joined with clarity, and the evidence is unmistakable. Even after years of struggle, long-term recovery is possible, and it's precisely why the experts tell us that irremediability in mental illness cannot be predicted. We simply don't have the medical grounds to declare a life beyond hope. We've already seen cases where people were approved for MAiD not because their condition was truly irremediable, but because they lacked housing, treatment, or basic support. That's not medicine. That's a system misreading desperation as destiny. We know individuals who once begged for death only to recover and contribute greatly, including my colleague from Elgin, London South, who openly speaks of a suicide attempt, a long journey back, and a life now filled with purpose. When a person is standing on the edge, the role of a responsible nation is to pull them back.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I so appreciate the direction that my colleague has gone today to protect those with a mental illness only. And I can say personally, having served this whole decade on Veterans Affairs, that this issue is being abused within our own government and with our veterans who come for help and are literally being suggested that they consider MAiD. This is outside of the scope of what should be happening, and they have even been offered funds for their family if they were to choose that. This is inappropriate, and I would ask the member her perspective on how this government is responding to the needs of people with mental illness.
Honourable Member for Cloverdale, Langley City.
I would thank my honourable colleague for the question. As it clearly stated in my speech, it isn't doing what it needs to do for those who are most in need. But I do want to also add that one of the most encouraging parts of this journey has been seeing how broad and diverse the support for this bill has really been. Tens of thousands of Canadians have written, called, and signed petitions to our office to say very clearly they don't want mental illness alone to be a basis for MAiD, and they want a real right to recover instead. That spans cultures, faiths, and professions and backgrounds. This bill unites people from many backgrounds right across the country, And that's the coalition standing behind Bill C-218.